I never thought a simple barbecue could lead to a war with my neighbor. But there I was, standing in my own backyard, spatula in hand, flipping burgers, when the most unexpected thing happened. The smoke from my grill, a harmless puff of deliciousness, suddenly turned me into the villain in my own neighborhood. It all started when Karen, yes, Karen, my seemingly normal neighbor, decided she'd had enough of my weekend cookouts. I had been grilling every weekend for years, and honestly, it was something I looked forward to. The smell of sizzling meat, the sound of laughter from friends and family, and the warm feeling of being outside in the fresh air made all the effort worth it. But that Saturday, something about the air felt different. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and it seemed like the perfect day for a barbecue. I was just getting the charcoal started when I noticed her. Karen, standing on her porch, was staring directly at me. Her arms were crossed, and her face was twisted in a look of pure disgust. At first, I thought she was just enjoying the smell, maybe thinking about whether she should come over and join in the fun. But no. As I flipped the burgers, I saw her start to march towards my yard with determination in her step. I thought, okay, maybe she wants to chat, ask how the BBQ's going, or even suggest a side dish. Boy, was I wrong. She didn't greet me. No friendly wave, no, hey, I'm enjoying the smell of those burgers. Instead, she stormed right up to the edge of my yard and, without any warning, started ranting. "Excuse me," she shouted, her voice high-pitched and demanding. "This has to stop. You are causing a disturbance." I looked around, confused. A disturbance? I asked, not even sure if I had heard her correctly. The smell of barbecue was drifting across the neighborhood, sure, but what was the big deal? "Yes," she snapped, pointing at the smoke billowing from my grill. "This is unacceptable. My windows are open, and I can't even breathe. You need to do something about this smoke, right now." At that moment, I felt a strange mix of disbelief and irritation. Was she really this upset about a little barbecue smoke? This wasn't some toxic fume or chemical spill. It was the smell of grilled meat, for crying out loud. But I tried to keep my cool. "Karen, I'm sorry if it's bothering you," I said, my voice calm, trying to defuse the situation. "But this is just a barbecue. It's a one-time thing. I'll be done in a couple of hours." She wasn't hearing any of it. One time? This is the third time in a row. And it's not just today, it's every weekend. Every time you fire up that grill, it gets worse. The smoke spreads, and it's everywhere. "You're ruining my weekends." I was stunned. 3 times? I had no idea my grilling habits had become such an issue. I had been grilling every weekend for as long as I could remember, and I never once got a complaint except from her. I glanced around, looking for support from the other neighbors, but nobody seemed to be bothered. In fact, a few of them waved at me, enjoying the nice weather and their own outdoor time. The air was warm, the day was perfect, and yet Karen seemed like she was ready to explode over a few puffs of smoke. "Karen, I'm just trying to enjoy a Saturday," I said, doing my best to stay patient. "I'll finish up soon. It's not a big deal." She shook her head, her face turning redder by the second. "It is a big deal," she shouted. "You have no idea what you're doing. I'm reporting you to the HOA. This is a violation of the neighborhood rules. This needs to stop." At that moment, I couldn't believe it. Reporting me to the HOA? Over barbecue smoke? I had heard of Karen's reputation as someone who didn't hesitate to report the smallest issues to the HOA, but this was ridiculous. I didn't want to escalate things, but something inside me snapped. "Fine, report me," I said, trying to stay calm. "But I'm not stopping. It's just a barbecue." She turned on her heel, muttering something under her breath about how I'd regret this. As she stormed back to her house, I couldn't help but wonder what she was going to do next. Would the HOA really get involved? Was I going to have to stop grilling every weekend for the rest of my life? But then, as I stood there, spatula in hand, flipping another burger, a thought crossed my mind. What if I could turn this into something much bigger than she could ever imagine? What if I could show her, and the whole neighborhood, just how far I was willing to go for my right to grill in my own backyard? As Karen stormed back to her house, I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. I had never imagined that a simple weekend barbecue could lead to such a confrontation. What had started as a relaxing Saturday had suddenly become a battleground. The thought of her reporting me to the HOA kept gnawing at me. I didn't know much about the HOA rules, but I knew one thing: Karen was not the kind of person to back down easily. She would make sure they heard her complaints. I couldn't just let this go. It was clear that if I didn't do something, this could become a regular issue. Every time I fired up the grill, Karen would be waiting to pounce, ready to make my life miserable. The idea of her controlling when and how I could enjoy my own backyard wasn't something I was willing to accept. As I went back to flipping burgers, I started thinking about my options. I could apologize and stop grilling, but that didn't feel right. Why should I give up something I enjoy just because one neighbor had a problem with it? I had a right to enjoy my yard, to share meals with my family, and to have a good time. No one should be able to take that away from me, not without a fight. But I knew that simply ignoring her complaints wouldn't work either. She had already made it clear that she wasn't going to let this go easily. I needed a plan. The more I thought about it, the more a certain idea started to form. What if I could turn this situation around? What if I could not only stand my ground, but make Karen regret ever bringing up the issue in the first place? I wasn't going to let her dictate what I could and couldn't do in my own yard. If she wanted to play this game, then I'd make it interesting. The next weekend, I decided to take things to the next level. Instead of just having a small barbecue, I would host the biggest cookout the neighborhood had ever seen. I would invite everyone, family, friends, neighbors, and make it so big that Karen wouldn't be able to ignore it. The smell of barbecue would be everywhere. It would be a celebration of food, friends, and freedom. I'd show Karen that not only would I continue grilling, but I would do so in a way that made it impossible for her to complain without looking like the villain. As I started making plans for the event, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. This was going to be more than just a barbecue. It was going to be a statement. I would be the one in control, not Karen. I wasn't just going to let her win. I wanted to make a statement not just to Karen, but to everyone in the neighborhood. This was about more than grilling. It was about standing up for my rights and showing that no one could push me around. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this could be the perfect opportunity to involve the entire neighborhood. I could make it an event that brought everyone together, something people would talk about for years to come. The HOA wouldn't be able to do anything about it, and Karen's complaints would look even more ridiculous in the face of such a grand gesture. If she wanted to complain about a little smoke, I would give her something she could really complain about, something that would make her wish she had never said a word. The plan was starting to take shape, and with every passing hour, I grew more determined. The cookout would be massive, complete with all the food, music, and fun that anyone could want. There would be games for the kids, drinks for the adults, and enough barbecue to feed the entire neighborhood. I was going to make sure that this wasn't just a victory for me, but a victory for everyone who had ever been put in a position where they felt like they had to apologize for enjoying life. This cookout would be my revenge, and it was going to be glorious. By the time the week came to an end, I had everything planned. Invitations were sent out, the grill was ready, and I was prepared for the best barbecue the neighborhood had ever seen. Karen had no idea what she was about to walk into. As I stood in my yard, looking over the preparations, I couldn't help but smile. This wasn't just about a barbecue anymore. It was about showing that I wasn't going to be pushed around. It was about making sure that Karen knew exactly who was in charge of my yard. The next day, I fired up the grill, and as the smoke began to rise, I knew this was only the beginning. Karen might have started a fight, but now I was ready to finish it in a way she would never forget. The day of the cookout arrived, and I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervous energy. I had never hosted anything on this scale before, but I was determined to make it a success. The grill was fired up, and the scent of sizzling meat filled the air, mingling with the sounds of laughter and chatter from the growing crowd. Neighbors were starting to trickle in, each of them surprised by the sheer size of the event. I had gone all out, long tables covered in food, drinks flowing, and music playing softly in the background. It wasn't just a barbecue anymore. It had transformed into a full-fledged neighborhood celebration. Karen, of course, had not been invited. I didn't want her anywhere near my party. As the afternoon wore on, the number of people in my backyard grew, and the atmosphere became even more festive. Children ran around playing games, adults mingled and enjoyed the food, and I made sure that every inch of my backyard was filled with smoke from the grill. The smell of barbecue was everywhere, and no one seemed to mind. I could see Karen's house from where I stood, and I couldn't help but notice the blinds twitching in her windows. It was clear she was watching everything unfold from behind closed curtains. At first, I wondered if she would come outside and make another scene, but she stayed inside, fuming quietly. It was probably for the best. With every passing minute, the sound of the laughter and the crackling of the grill grew louder, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This was exactly what she didn't want, and it felt great to know that I was the one in control now. By early evening, the party was in full swing. More neighbors had come over, many of them bringing their own dishes and contributing to the feast. I made sure that everyone knew this was a celebration of freedom, the kind of freedom that came from being able to enjoy life without someone else dictating the rules. I couldn't help but notice that the atmosphere was different from past gatherings. People were smiling, having fun, and most importantly, they were united. It was clear that the neighborhood was coming together in a way that hadn't happened before, and I was proud to be the one who had brought everyone together. Karen was still in her house, but now I could see her pacing back and forth behind her windows. It was almost like she was waiting for an opportunity to storm outside and confront me. I could imagine her, fuming in frustration, probably considering calling the HOA at any moment. But she didn't. Instead, she stayed inside, watching from afar as the event continued. At one point, I saw her open her front door and stand on the porch, staring across at the chaos in my yard. I couldn't help but grin. She was probably debating whether to come over and make a scene, but she seemed to hesitate. As the day wore on, it became clear that Karen was not going to be able to stop what was happening. The cookout was in full swing, and no matter how hard she tried to control it, she couldn't. As nightfall came and the barbecue turned into a casual party, I stood back for a moment to take it all in. The people, the food, the music, it was everything I had imagined. I had turned what was supposed to be a simple complaint into an event that brought the whole neighborhood together. It was my victory, and it was starting to feel like a statement. A statement not just to Karen, but to everyone who had ever been told what they could or couldn't do in their own homes. But just when I thought everything was going perfectly, Karen finally made her move. She marched over to the side of the yard, her face red with anger. The moment she crossed the boundary into my yard, the crowd fell silent, watching with curiosity. I could tell Karen had no idea what she was walking into. She thought she was going to shut everything down, to ruin my moment, but what she didn't realize was that this cookout wasn't just for me. It was for everyone who had ever been silenced. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but before she could get a word out, I raised my hand and calmly addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said with a smile, "this is the point of this cookout. To show that we, as a neighborhood, have the right to enjoy our homes and our lives without fear of unnecessary complaints. To Karen, I say, we will continue to grill. We will continue to have fun. And no one will tell us otherwise." The crowd erupted in applause, and Karen stood there, momentarily stunned by the outpouring of support. The tension in the air was palpable, and for the first time, I saw Karen falter. She had no response. She had thought this would be a fight she could win, but now, in front of everyone, she had become the villain in a story that she had started but could no longer control. She turned on her heel, muttering under her breath as she walked back to her house, and the crowd slowly began to cheer. The atmosphere shifted, and I knew in that moment that I had won. This wasn't just about the barbecue anymore. It was about showing that even in the face of adversity, you didn't have to back down. You could stand your ground, and sometimes, that's exactly what it took to turn things around. As Karen retreated to her house, the energy in my backyard shifted. What had begun as a small barbecue had now turned into something much larger. The crowd's energy was infectious, and I could feel the sense of victory building within me. The applause had died down, but the atmosphere remained electric, as though the entire neighborhood had just experienced something significant. People lingered, chatting and laughing, and the sounds of the cookout resumed. But even with Karen's defeat, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. She hadn't backed down entirely, she was just regrouping. I could feel it in my gut. Karen would find a way to make her presence known again, but now, I was ready for whatever she threw at me. The night continued, and as the hours passed, the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the yard. More neighbors came, and more food was served. The kids played in the yard, the adults enjoyed their drinks, and the music played on, creating a lively backdrop to the evening. But even as I reveled in the success of the event, I kept an eye on Karen's house. She hadn't left her porch, and the lights inside remained dim. I could only imagine what she was planning. Just as I thought the night might come to a peaceful close, Karen made her move again. This time, she wasn't alone. She had enlisted the help of a few members of the HOA. I saw them walking down the street toward my house, all stiff and formal in their suits, looking like they had just stepped out of a corporate board meeting. They weren't there to socialize. They were there to do what Karen had promised. I knew what was coming next. The group stopped just outside my yard, and I could see Karen standing by her front door, watching the scene unfold. I could feel a moment of tension settle in the air. The music seemed to dim in the background as the group of HOA members looked at me, waiting for me to approach them. For a brief moment, everything felt like it was about to come crashing down. But then, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel fear or anxiety. I felt calm, even empowered. I had the support of my neighbors, and I wasn't about to let a few formalities ruin everything I had worked for. I approached the HOA members, ready to face whatever they had to say. The leader of the group, a man named Mr. Jacobs, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. He wasn't unfriendly, but there was a sense of authority in his voice. "We've received multiple complaints about your barbecue gatherings, and it's been brought to our attention that this is an ongoing issue," he said, his tone formal but not threatening. The HOA's guidelines state that certain outdoor activities need to be regulated, particularly when it affects the well-being of the community. For a moment, I wondered if this was the end of the line. Would I have to shut down the cookout? Would Karen's complaints be enough to force me to comply with the HOA's demands? But as I stood there, with my neighbors watching from the sidelines, I realized something. The HOA could make all the rules they wanted, but this wasn't just about barbecue smoke anymore. This was about the freedom to live in your own home without feeling like you were under constant scrutiny. I stood tall and responded without hesitation. "I understand that you have guidelines," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But this cookout isn't just about me grilling in my yard. This is about community. It's about bringing people together, enjoying good food, and celebrating the simple joys of life. No one is complaining about the noise, the food, or the smoke, except for Karen. And I'm sure she's going to keep filing complaints, no matter what I do." Mr. Jacobs looked at me for a moment, clearly weighing his options. I could tell he wasn't used to being challenged. The rest of the HOA members stood silently, unsure of how to respond. Behind them, I saw Karen standing at the door, her arms crossed and a scowl on her face. I could see the frustration in her eyes. She thought this was going to be easy, just a few complaints and I'd roll over. But I wasn't going to let that happen. "Well," Mr. Jacobs said after a moment, "we'll need to look into this further. But we do take these matters seriously. If there are enough complaints, we may have to take action." Before I could respond, one of the neighbors, a woman named Susan who lived across the street, stepped forward. "Actually," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I think we all need to have a say in this. We're all here enjoying the cookout. We're all part of this community, and we've never had a problem with the barbecue. Karen is the only one complaining, and frankly, we're tired of hearing it." The crowd, which had been quietly listening, suddenly erupted into applause. More people joined in, voicing their support for the event. It was clear now that the HOA had lost control of the situation. Karen had overplayed her hand, and now she was the one isolated. Mr. Jacobs looked around at the gathered neighbors, who were all nodding in agreement. For a brief moment, I saw the wheels turning in his head. Finally, he sighed and turned back to me. "I see this has become more of a community issue than we anticipated. We'll have to discuss it further, but for now, we'll leave you to your event." With that, the HOA members turned and walked away, their heads low and shoulders slumped. Karen, standing in the doorway, was livid. She watched as they left, but she knew the fight was over. The moment had passed, and the entire neighborhood had rallied behind the cookout. The support was overwhelming, and in that instant, I realized I had won. Not just the cookout, but the bigger battle for my right to live freely in my own home. As the night drew to a close, I looked around at the smiling faces, the happy chatter, and the children running around with sticky fingers from the ice cream they had devoured. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The cookout had been everything I hoped for and more. It wasn't just a victory for me, it was a victory for the community, for standing together against unnecessary rules and for celebrating life on our own terms. The night ended on a high note, with the last of the guests heading home and the laughter slowly fading into the night. As I stood in the quiet of my backyard, the glow of the string lights hanging above casting a soft light, I felt a sense of accomplishment. The barbecue had been a resounding success. But as the night wore on and the last plates were cleared away, I knew that while I had won the battle, the war wasn't completely over. Karen was still lurking, and I was sure she wasn't going to let this humiliation slide without another attempt to regain control. The next few days were eerily quiet. There were no more complaints from Karen, no sudden visits from the HOA. For a while, it seemed like everything had settled down. My neighbors went about their daily routines, the cookout becoming just another story we would all share when we bumped into each other in the street or at the grocery store. I went back to grilling on weekends, but I kept a low profile, enjoying my peace. But I knew it couldn't last forever. Karen had been quiet, yes, but I could feel the storm brewing. She wasn't the type to just let things go. And sure enough, a week later, it happened. I was sitting in my living room when I heard the sound of loud knocking at my door. I opened it to find not just Karen standing there, but also a few familiar faces. Members of the HOA, including Mr. Jacobs, who had been at the cookout, were standing behind her. The look on Karen's face was one of pure determination, and I could see the fury bubbling underneath. I didn't need to ask what this was about. Karen wasted no time. She launched into a tirade about how the cookout had caused enough of a disruption, how it had been an embarrassment to her and to the neighborhood. She went on about the smoke, the noise, the chaos. But this time, I wasn't intimidated. Instead of letting her words get to me, I just stood there, calm and composed. The HOA members stood silently behind her, clearly waiting for her to finish her rant. I could tell they didn't have the same fire in their eyes as she did. They seemed almost resigned to the situation, like they were just going through the motions because Karen had demanded it. Finally, she stopped talking, and I took my turn to speak. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My calm demeanor spoke volumes. I told her that I had hosted a peaceful cookout, that it was well within my rights to enjoy my property without constant complaints, and that the neighborhood had rallied around the event. The neighbors had spoken out, and the HOA had no real grounds to force me to stop. I made it clear that I wasn't going to be intimidated or silenced by her any longer. This wasn't just about a barbecue. It was about my right to live freely, to enjoy my home without fear of harassment. The HOA members exchanged uneasy glances. They had already seen how the neighborhood had rallied behind me, and they knew there wasn't much they could do. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't just about Karen's complaint. It was about something larger, a community coming together and standing up against one person's attempt to control everyone's life. Mr. Jacobs finally spoke, his voice softer than it had been the last time we spoke. "We'll look into this further," he said, but I could hear the hesitation in his voice. "But as of now, there doesn't seem to be any violation of the neighborhood guidelines. The cookout was a one-time event, and there's no need for further action." Karen's face flushed with anger. She had expected them to side with her, to help her put an end to what she considered an unsanctioned gathering. But they hadn't. They were backing down, and she knew it. The power she had once wielded was slipping away. With one last glare, Karen turned and stormed off, leaving the HOA members standing in the doorway, awkward and unsure of how to proceed. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a sense of finality. Karen had been defeated. The HOA had been powerless in the face of the community's support. The neighborhood had spoken, and they were on my side. It was clear now that Karen had lost this battle, and she knew it. But more than just winning this small fight, I felt like I had gained something much more important, the respect and unity of my neighbors. The barbecue had become more than just an event. It had become a symbol of resistance, of standing up for what was right, and it had brought the community closer than ever before. Karen's attempts to control our lives had only strengthened our resolve. As I looked out the window, seeing neighbors still chatting and waving as they walked by, I realized that this cookout wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for all of us. Days turned into weeks, and the neighborhood slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The tension that had once hung heavy in the air had dissipated, and the barbecue incident became a topic of friendly banter rather than conflict. What started as a battle over something as simple as barbecue smoke had transformed into a moment of unity for the entire community. Even Karen, who had once been the thorn in everyone's side, seemed to retreat into the shadows. She never made another attempt to disrupt the peace, and the HOA, once so eager to intervene, now kept its distance, unwilling to get involved any further. Life in the neighborhood had returned to normal, but it felt different. The people I had once casually waved at on my way to the mailbox had become friends, allies, and partners in a shared experience. We all knew what had happened, and we all knew how it had brought us closer together. The simple act of grilling had created a bond that went beyond the smoky scent of meat on the grill. It had been a reminder of what it meant to stand up for what was right, even when it felt like the odds were against you. I still fired up the grill every weekend, as I always had. But now, it wasn't just for me. It was for all of us. The sound of sizzling meat in the air no longer felt like an act of defiance, but rather a celebration of the freedom we had fought for. Neighbors would often stop by, just to hang out, share a plate, or bring a side dish. The backyard had become a place where everyone could gather without fear of judgment or complaint, a place where laughter and good food were the only things that mattered. And then, one day, something unexpected happened. As I was grilling and chatting with a few neighbors, Karen came walking down the street. At first, I thought she was just passing by, but she didn't keep walking. She stopped in front of my house, hesitated for a moment, and then approached me. It was the first time I had seen her since the cookout, and there was a different look in her eyes. She wasn't angry. She wasn't confrontational. She seemed defeated, but in a way that was oddly humbling. She stood there for a few moments before speaking. "I just wanted to say," she began, her voice quiet and uncharacteristically calm, "I'm sorry. I overreacted. I didn't realize how much my complaints were affecting everyone." She paused, taking a deep breath as if gathering the courage to continue. "I was wrong. I didn't see the bigger picture." The words didn't come easily for her, but they came nonetheless. For the first time, I saw a glimpse of the person behind the bitterness, the person who had once been so insistent on making everyone follow her rules. It was a moment of humility, a moment where she acknowledged the harm she had caused. I stood there for a moment, surprised, before offering a simple smile. "It's okay, Karen. We all get caught up in things sometimes. The important thing is that we've moved past it. The neighborhood is stronger now, and we're all better for it." With a nod, Karen turned to leave, and as she walked away, I felt a sense of finality. It was over. The battle had been fought, not with anger or violence, but with unity, community, and the determination to do what was right. Karen had learned that not everything could be controlled, and in the end, she had been the one to step back. As I looked around at the neighbors gathered in my backyard, enjoying the food, the conversation, and the simple joy of each other's company, I realized something. The barbecue had been about much more than the smoke or the food. It had been about standing together, about showing that the voice of one person, no matter how loud or persistent, could never drown out the collective will of a community. We had proven that, together, we could overcome anything. The next weekend, as I fired up the grill once again, I couldn't help but smile. The smoke rose into the air, and the sound of laughter filled the yard. This was what life was about: freedom, unity, and the simple pleasures of sharing a meal with those who mattered most. And for the first time in a long time, I knew that Karen, wherever she was, had learned a valuable lesson. You can't control everything. Sometimes, the best way to handle a challenge is with a little creativity, a lot of support, and a big, delicious barbecue. It was supposed to be a perfect Sunday afternoon, the kind of day where you throw some meat on the grill, invite a couple of friends over, and enjoy the warmth of a lazy summer day. I had planned everything to the smallest detail: the marinated ribs soaking in their sauce, the cold beers chilling in the cooler, and the sound of the backyard humdrum with laughter and music. My friends and I had been looking forward to this cookout for weeks, and I was finally living the dream of hosting the best barbecue in the neighborhood. I stood outside, watching the coals on the grill start to glow, the smell of sizzling meat already filling the air. It was one of those rare moments where everything just felt right. The sun was setting slowly, casting an orange glow across the backyard. My neighbors, a couple of blocks down, had their windows open, and the sounds of their kids playing could be heard faintly. I wasn't bothering anyone, and in my opinion, this was the kind of weekend everyone should be able to enjoy. A simple, peaceful barbecue on my own land. But then, as I flipped the ribs, I saw her. The last person I ever thought would interfere. Karen. She was standing at the end of my driveway, arms crossed, glaring in my direction. Her usual frizzy hair was tightly pulled back into a bun, and her sharp, overdone sunglasses gave her the look of someone who had just walked out of an office meeting rather than a suburban neighborhood. She lived in the house 2 doors down from me, a self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, and had a way of showing up at the most inconvenient times, usually with something to complain about. It had been years since I moved in, and I had learned quickly that Karen was the type to take offense at anything that didn't fit her idea of what a neat neighborhood should be. From my garden's flowers to my mailbox placement, it seemed like nothing was ever quite right in her eyes. I tried to ignore her at first. It was a barbecue, for crying out loud. I wasn't playing loud music, and the smoke wasn't even that bad. It was just a bit of grill smoke, and surely that was a natural part of cooking, right? But then I saw her walk toward my front door, her pace deliberate. The last thing I wanted was another one of her lectures, so I braced myself for the inevitable. She knocked, and I opened the door, trying to maintain a pleasant smile despite the sinking feeling in my stomach. She stood there, looking down her nose at me, her expression stern. "Hello, Alex," she said, her voice cold as ever. "I need to speak with you." "Hey, Karen, what's up?" I asked, trying to keep it light. "I've been getting complaints about the smoke and noise coming from your backyard," she said, as though she was delivering a report, not a complaint. "I know you think it's just a small gathering, but it's affecting the whole neighborhood." I blinked, stunned. Complaints? From who? I had only invited a few close friends over, and we hadn't even been loud. The grill was sizzling, sure, but I wasn't hosting a festival. "With all due respect, Karen, this is my property, and I'm just having a few friends over for a barbecue." "It's not that big of a deal," I said, trying to keep my tone even. I had dealt with her before, and I wasn't in the mood for another confrontation. "Well, it is a big deal to some people," she continued, her voice turning more insistent. "The smoke is blowing over into my yard, and we have an HOA rule about smoke rising above a certain level. You're violating it." I froze. HOA rule? Since when did an HOA dictate how much smoke could rise from a grill? My mind raced. I had never signed anything with an HOA. In fact, I'd gone out of my way to make sure I wasn't part of one when I bought the house. The property was outside of any HOA jurisdiction. It was the reason I moved here in the first place, the freedom to do whatever I wanted with my own space. "I don't think there's any HOA here," I said, confusion starting to take over. "This is private land, Karen. You don't have any jurisdiction over what I do here." Her smile tightened, and her eyes narrowed. "I don't need jurisdiction to report this to the proper authorities," she said coldly. "And I will, if you don't take action right now." Before I could respond, she turned on her heel and marched off toward her house without another word. I stood there in the doorway, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The audacity. Who was she to come onto my property, tell me how to run my household, and then threaten to report me over a damn barbecue? It was infuriating, but I tried to shrug it off. If she wanted to waste her time complaining, that was on her. I was still going to enjoy my cookout. Little did I know, this would be the start of something much bigger than I had imagined. Not long after, I saw the flashing lights in my rearview mirror as I was heading inside to grab another round of drinks. The sound of sirens made my heart drop into my stomach. Had Karen actually called the cops? Sure enough, there was a police cruiser parked at the end of my driveway. My blood ran cold as I walked out to meet the officer, already dreading what this might mean as I approached the officer. My mind raced with disbelief. I had never imagined something like this could escalate to the point of involving the police over a simple barbecue. The officer, a young man in his mid-30s, stepped out of his car and gave me a quick glance. He was clearly trying to stay neutral, but there was an awkwardness in the air. He seemed like he didn't quite know what to do with the situation either. I could see his eyes flicker toward the grill, where the smoke was now rising in wisps above the backyard fence, barely noticeable in the light breeze. I stood there, waiting for him to speak, already feeling the anger simmering beneath my skin. The officer cleared his throat, glancing at the piece of paper in his hand. "Sir, we received a complaint about noise and smoke coming from your property. Apparently, there have been multiple concerns raised." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The whole thing seemed utterly ridiculous. I had a grill going and a handful of friends over. Nothing that should warrant police involvement. The officer continued, trying to maintain a professional tone, but I could tell he was uncomfortable. He was clearly aware that he was being called in to mediate a situation that seemed more like a petty neighborhood squabble than anything legitimate. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm despite the absurdity of it all. "I'm sorry, officer, but this is private property. I'm not causing a disturbance. I'm just cooking some food. If people don't like the smell, they don't have to be here. I'm not violating any laws." The officer nodded slowly, clearly unsure of how to proceed. He glanced down the street as if hoping to find some indication of how to handle the situation. I could only imagine Karen, sitting in her house, watching this unfold from behind her blinds, probably relishing every moment of the chaos she'd caused. Her mission was clear: to make my peaceful afternoon feel like an out-of-control party. After a long pause, the officer sighed. "Look, I'm just here to make sure everything's under control. There's no need to get worked up. I'll just file a report and make sure this is documented. but it seems like you're not doing anything wrong." I felt a sense of relief, but it was short-lived. Karen had already made her move, and now it was just a matter of time before she found another way to make my life miserable. As the officer began to head back to his cruiser, I noticed a second car pulling up. A black sedan with tinted windows, marked with the familiar HOA logo on the side. My stomach sank. This was it. Karen wasn't content with just calling the police. She had now brought the so-called neighborhood enforcement into the mix. Two men, dressed in matching uniforms with the HOA's insignia, stepped out of the car. Their presence made everything feel even more surreal. It was like something out of a bad movie. These men weren't real security officers. They were just enforcers for Karen's personal agenda. The taller one, with a stiff posture and a clipboard in hand, looked me up and down before making a beeline for the backyard. Without saying a word, he began to walk toward the grill area, as if he had some sort of authority to stop me. I couldn't believe it. This was going way too far. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice rising, frustration now boiling over. "What do you think you're doing on my property?" The man with the clipboard didn't even flinch, his eyes remaining fixed on the grill as he scribbled something down on the paper. "We've received reports that you're violating neighborhood standards by having smoke and noise disturbances," he said flatly, barely looking up from his notes. "We're here to ensure compliance." Compliance? The words rang in my ears like a bad joke. The thought of Karen sitting somewhere, gleefully orchestrating this circus, was enough to push me to the edge. I wasn't about to let some HOA goon dictate what I could and couldn't do on my own land. I took a few steps forward, standing between the man and the grill. "You're not welcome here," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I don't pay HOA fees. I'm not part of your so-called community. You have no jurisdiction here." The taller man blinked, clearly taken aback by my response. He opened his mouth as if to argue but quickly closed it. The silence between us stretched for what felt like an eternity, with only the sound of the sizzling grill breaking the tension. The other man, shorter and stockier, stood quietly by, waiting for his partner to take the lead. It seemed like they didn't know what to do next. Finally, after a long pause, the taller man let out a sharp breath and looked over his shoulder toward the officer, who was still standing near his car, seemingly unsure of how far things had escalated. The officer gave a quick wave as if to say, "It's not my problem," and got back into his car. The moment he drove off, I knew it was far from over. Karen wasn't going to let me off the hook so easily. This was her game now, and she would stop at nothing to make sure I learned my lesson. The men from the HOA glanced at each other, clearly aware that their presence here was unwelcome, but they weren't leaving. One of them spoke again, though his words felt more like a warning than an offer. "This isn't over," he said coldly. "We'll be back if the complaints continue." And with that, they turned on their heels and made their way back to their car, leaving me standing there, seething with frustration. The backyard, which had once been filled with the pleasant sound of friends and laughter, felt oddly silent. Even the grill seemed to lose its warmth as I stared after the car pulling away. This was just the beginning, and Karen wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. The next few days were quiet, almost unnervingly so. It was as if Karen had disappeared into the shadows, biding her time for the next move. I went back to my routine, trying to push the events of that ridiculous day out of my mind. But every time I stepped outside, I couldn't help but glance toward the end of the street, half expecting to see Karen's car pull into my driveway once again. I went about my work, kept the grill out of sight, and tried to enjoy the peace that I had once thought was my right to enjoy. But the peace felt fleeting, as if it were just a temporary calm before the storm. It wasn't until the following weekend that things started to escalate again. I had planned to spend the Saturday afternoon working on some small repairs around the house, fixing a few fences, cleaning up the garden, just some minor tasks to get ahead of the usual upkeep. I had learned my lesson the first time. Don't make any noise that could draw attention. Don't do anything that could be twisted into another violation. I thought I was being cautious, but Karen had a way of making you feel like you were always one step away from breaking some imagined rule. I was in the backyard, hammering a nail into a fence post when I saw her. Karen's figure appeared at the edge of my property, her silhouette sharp against the bright sky. She was walking slowly, methodically, as though she had all the time in the world to harass me. My pulse quickened as she got closer, and I knew that I couldn't avoid another confrontation. This time, however, I was ready. She stopped at the gate, her eyes scanning the yard before landing on me. Without a word, she reached into her bag and pulled out a piece of paper. The same smug look that I had seen on her face before returned, as if she believed she was winning some kind of personal battle. My heart sank as she approached the fence and held the paper up for me to see. It was another notice, this one more official-looking, with bold lettering and a logo I hadn't seen before. My blood boiled as I read the words. It was another one of Karen's fabricated complaints, this time claiming that I was violating local zoning laws by hosting gatherings and using excessive outdoor equipment. She had gone as far as to include a vague reference to community aesthetics and how my property was now deemed unsightly. The audacity of it all made me want to laugh, but there was a small part of me that was starting to realize how serious she was. She wasn't just being petty anymore. She had figured out how to weaponize the system, creating problems out of thin air and making it seem like I was the one in the wrong. I folded the notice in half, crumpling it into a tight ball and tossing it into the trash without even responding. But I could feel my frustration rising. How many times would I have to deal with this before she understood that she didn't have any right to dictate what happened on my land? The next morning, as I sat at the kitchen table sipping my coffee, I saw her again. This time from the window. She was standing by the mailbox, watching my house with those icy eyes of hers. I could almost feel her calculating, trying to figure out what my next move would be. I had no doubt that she was hoping to see me do something that would give her the excuse she needed to escalate things further. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I decided to call in a favor. I picked up the phone and dialed the local attorney I had worked with a few years back. I explained the situation as clearly as I could, outlining everything from the barbecue incident to Karen's continued harassment. The lawyer listened carefully, and after a few minutes of back and forth, he agreed to help. He suggested that we take proactive legal action before things could get worse. He advised me to start documenting every interaction I had with Karen and her HOA cronies, keeping a record of the notices and any other interactions. He also recommended that I file for a temporary restraining order against Karen, making it clear that her behavior had crossed the line into harassment. I knew this was the only way to make sure Karen couldn't just keep coming onto my property and making these baseless complaints. The law was on my side, but I had to be smart about it. If I could get the legal process rolling, it would give me the protection I needed. It wasn't just about winning. It was about putting a stop to her antics before she could cause any more trouble. That afternoon, I sent the lawyer a list of all the events, along with copies of the notices Karen had sent. I made sure to document everything, from the moment she had first approached me about the barbecue to the more recent attempts to intimidate me into complying with her demands. I felt a sense of relief, knowing that I was no longer fighting this battle alone. With the right legal support, I would finally be able to put an end to this harassment once and for all. But as the days passed, Karen didn't back down. Instead, she upped the ante. I woke up one morning to find a large, official-looking letter stuck to my front door. My heart sank as I read it, and I realized just how far she was willing to go to try to take control of my property. The letter was from an attorney she had hired on her behalf, demanding that I remove all non-compliant structures, including my fence, the shed, and even my garden. The audacity of it left me speechless. She was trying to use the legal system against me, hoping to scare me into submission. But I wasn't about to back down. With the lawyer now on my side, I knew this was just another empty threat. It was clear that Karen wasn't used to people standing up to her, and she was about to learn that I wouldn't let her push me around anymore. The days that followed were filled with an unsettling quiet, but it was the calm before the storm. I spent the majority of my time on the phone with the lawyer, going over every piece of evidence I had gathered. My lawyer was confident, but he warned me that Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. As expected, her next move came swiftly. A few days after the letter arrived, I found another notice on my doorstep, this time a summons to appear in court for a hearing on the alleged property violations. The charges were absurd. Basically, Karen had made up a list of offenses ranging from non-compliant structures to noise disturbances. It was clear she was throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick. But the more she pushed, the more desperate she seemed. I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Every day I walked past the grill, I thought about how it all started. Just a simple barbecue, a few friends, and a peaceful Sunday. Now, it had turned into a full-blown legal battle, with Karen throwing accusations and false claims at me. But what struck me the most was how she had managed to drag the local authorities into it. First, it was the police, then her fake HOA security, and now, a court summons. It wasn't just about a grill anymore. It was about her power play, her need to control every aspect of the neighborhood, and her willingness to use whatever means necessary to make sure everyone followed her version of the rules. The court date loomed closer, and I could feel the tension building in my chest. I spent every spare moment preparing for the case, reading over every piece of legal jargon and making sure I understood my rights. The more I learned about the law, the more I realized just how unjust Karen's actions had been. She had been using her so-called position as HOA president to manipulate the system, threatening neighbors and making them believe she had some kind of authority over private property. But I was done being intimidated. I wasn't going to let her win. I knew that if I let her get away with this, it would only encourage her to go after someone else next. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. As I entered the courtroom, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I kept my head high. The room was filled with tension, the air thick with unspoken words. Karen was sitting across from me, her face a mask of arrogance and self-righteousness. She barely glanced at me as I walked in, her eyes fixed on the attorney sitting beside her. It was as if she thought she had already won. But I wasn't going to let her control the narrative this time. The judge entered, and the room quieted instantly. The proceedings began, and I sat there, listening as Karen's lawyer presented her case. It was full of exaggerated claims, most of which didn't even make sense. I could feel my frustration building, but I kept my composure. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, and with a calm but firm voice, I explained the situation. I presented the evidence, photos, written records, even the letters she had sent me. I explained how she had used her influence as HOA president to try to intimidate me, how she had attempted to manipulate the local authorities, and how her actions had crossed the line into harassment. I made it clear that I wasn't some pushover. I wasn't going to let her bully me into submission, and I certainly wasn't going to give up my rights to my own property. As the judge listened, I could see Karen's smug expression start to falter. It was as if she realized for the first time that she wasn't in control anymore. Her lawyer fumbled with his notes, trying to counter my arguments, but it was too late. The evidence spoke for itself. By the end of the hearing, it was clear that Karen had overstepped in every way possible. The judge ruled in my favor, dismissing the charges and ordering Karen to cease all further attempts to interfere with my property. It was a victory, not just for me, but for everyone who had ever felt bullied or intimidated by someone like her. As I left the courthouse, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. The battle was finally over. Karen, defeated, would have to live with the consequences of her actions. And as for me, I could finally return to my life, free from the shadow she had cast over my home. But deep down, I knew that she wouldn't give up so easily. People like Karen don't learn from their mistakes. They just find new ways to make others' lives miserable. But for now, I had one. And that, I knew, was all that mattered. The weeks that followed the court ruling were peaceful, but there was an unsettling sense of tension that lingered. Karen may have lost the case, but I knew she wasn't the type to just accept defeat and fade into the background. I kept my guard up, watching my property more closely, aware that she was the type of person who could never let go of a grudge. But surprisingly, the expected retaliation didn't come right away. Instead, I focused on moving forward, trying to enjoy the quiet that had returned to my life. I worked on small projects around the house, spent more time in the backyard, and finally returned to enjoying my weekends without worrying about the next surprise Karen might have in store. It wasn't until a month later that the storm broke again. One evening, just as the sun was setting, I heard a vehicle pull into the driveway. It was a dark, unmarked truck, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I watched it roll to a stop at the edge of my property. I had no idea who it could be, but my instincts told me that this wasn't some random visitor. I stood up, slowly, my eyes fixed on the truck as two men got out. They didn't look like anyone from the neighborhood. No friendly faces, no familiar neighbors. The first man, tall and broad-shouldered, was carrying a clipboard, while the second was a little shorter and seemed less confident. I could tell immediately that they weren't here for any friendly visit. My stomach dropped as I recognized the vague shape of a uniform underneath their jackets. It was the same kind of security uniform that had shown up at my door during Karen's last round of harassment. I had no doubt that this wasn't an official visit from any legitimate authorities. These were her goons. I quickly walked out of the house, keeping my distance but making sure they knew I was watching. They didn't acknowledge me as they walked toward my gate, their heads down, focused on whatever task they were about to carry out. My heart was racing in my chest, and I knew I wasn't about to let them trespass on my property again. This time, I had the law on my side, and I wasn't going to back down. As they reached the fence, the taller man held up a clipboard and started making notes, clearly pretending to assess something as if it were their job to do so. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for another confrontation, but before I could even speak, I heard the unmistakable sound of an engine coming from the end of the road. It was the sheriff's deputy. I watched as the deputy's car came into view, slowing as it approached my driveway. The two men froze, and for a brief moment, their fake confidence faltered. The deputy, a calm, collected middle-aged man, stepped out of the car and took one look at the two intruders. There was no doubt in my mind that he was aware of who they were and what they were up to. He had seen this kind of thing before. People pretending to be official, throwing their weight around, but having no real authority. The deputy approached them slowly, his expression unreadable. The two men glanced at each other, realizing that their bluff had been called. It was clear they weren't prepared for the sheriff's involvement, and it was even clearer that they had no idea how to handle the situation. The deputy didn't waste any time. He addressed them directly, his voice firm and authoritative. I couldn't hear the words from where I was standing, but the shift in their demeanor was enough to tell me everything I needed to know. The two men started to back away from the fence, clearly realizing that they were on the wrong side of the law. Within moments, they were back in their truck, speeding off without another word. The deputy turned toward me, a faint smile on his lips. He nodded in my direction, acknowledging that the situation was handled. As the truck disappeared down the road, I felt the weight of the past few months lift off my shoulders. For the first time in ages, I could breathe without constantly looking over my shoulder. But I knew this wasn't the end. People like Karen don't let go that easily. I had made my peace with the fact that I would have to be vigilant. As I stood there, watching the deputy's car drive away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last I'd see of her. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had the law on my side, and the next time she tried anything, I'd be ready. In the months that followed, I took steps to further secure my property. I added more cameras, installed stronger locks on the gates, and made sure that I kept a record of every interaction I had with anyone who came onto my land. I wasn't going to let anyone, Karen or anyone else, cross the line again. The final straw came when, months later, I saw her car parked across the street one evening. She was sitting in the driver's seat, watching my house. At that moment, I realized that I had the power to end this once and for all. I had done everything I needed to do to protect myself and my property, and now it was time to ensure she never tried to interfere again. I picked up my phone and dialed the sheriff's office, filing a formal complaint against her for continued harassment and stalking. This time, I made sure to include the footage of her car parked outside my house. It was clear she was trying to intimidate me again, and I wasn't going to let her. The sheriff's office responded quickly, taking the matter seriously, and soon, Karen was served with a cease and desist order, preventing her from coming anywhere near my property. The harassment had finally stopped. In the end, Karen was forced to face the consequences of her actions. She lost her position as HOA president after an internal investigation revealed her abuse of power, and her attempts to annex my property into the HOA were exposed as the personal vendetta they truly were. The neighborhood, once divided by her control, began to rebuild, and I, too, started to rebuild the peace that I had once taken for granted. It wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for anyone who had ever been made to feel small by people like Karen. I had stood my ground, fought for my rights, and in the end, I won. And as I sat back, Finally enjoying another quiet evening with my family, I knew that the worst was behind me, for good.